Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. I hope everyone is doing well, inshaAllah. Of the moments in the life of the Prophet that truly need to be highlighted and studied is the moment where the Prophet was finally able to go back and to conquer Mecca once again. The history that the Prophet had with Mecca was a very special history. At the end of the day, this was the city where he had grown up in. This was the city where he had lived for so many years. And for many of us Muslims, it might be quite interesting to remember and remind ourselves that in the 23 years of the prophethood of the Prophet, the majority of it, in fact, did not take place in Medina. And most of it, in fact, took place in Mecca. Therefore, Mecca and the Prophet have a very special connection. And finally, after 8 years of being in Medina, the Prophet has the opportunity to go back for the conquest of Mecca. This is not, of course, the first attempt. The first attempt, at least to enter Mecca, was done in the 6th year after Hijrah. But of course, we know the Treaty of Hudaybiyah took place. They did not allow the Muslims to come in, and so on and so forth. Now, in the 8th year, after the treaty has been broken by Quraysh, the Prophet has now put together his full army. The lesson to learn from this moment is two things. First of all, the forgiveness and the kindness that the Prophet shows when he has the ability to assert full domination and full authority over many people in Mecca who had bothered him, who had, persecuted him and his followers for many years. That is number one. And number two, how the Prophet never forgot his companions who had worked so hard for him throughout the years to get him to the conquest of Mecca. So this reminds you of how Islam teaches us when it comes to your relatives, you keep that relationship. If they do something wrong against you, if it's possible for you, if you can, you would forgive them. Yes? Of course, it doesn't make sense to rush into forgiveness. Sometimes people are guilted into forgiveness. This is not what Islam teaches. But if it's possible for me, if I can, sometimes I might need some more time, and so on and so forth. This is as it relates to my relatives. You find the Quran also teaches us, and Islam also teaches us to never forget about our friends. Sometimes friends who are closer even than relatives to us. In both of these aspects you find in the conquest of Mecca. The Prophet put together his army. We know that ahead of time he let Abu Sufyan know of the size of his army, so much so that Abu Sufyan, of course, came and saw the army before the army entered even into Mecca. And because of that, there was no resistance. There was not even an attempt to try to fight the army of the Prophet. And this was from the wisdom of the Prophet, because he wanted to make sure that entering into Mecca is done in the most efficient way with the least possible bloodshed. So the Prophet was entering into Mecca. 10,000 troops, some numbers have said, the Prophet had with him. Some numbers are less than that. Easily in the thousands. So the tables have completely turned since the Battle of Ahzab or the Battle of Khandaq, where things were exactly the opposite and the other way around. When he is entering, the army starts to walk in front of Abu Sufyan. And there's a famous story that's narrated that says that one of the companions of the Prophet then turned to Abu Sufyan and said, "O Abu Sufyan, al-yawm yawmul malhama. Today is the day where we take revenge. Today is the day where we attack." And so as the army continued to march in front of Abu Sufyan, the Prophet came to pass as well. And as he was passing, Abu Sufyan turned to the Prophet and said, "O Muhammad, is it true what your companion is saying, that today is the day of revenge?" And the narration says the Prophet turned to Abu Sufyan and said, "No, he is incorrect. Al-yawm yawmul marhama. Today is the day of forgiveness." And you also saw this forgiveness when the Prophet finally gathered all of his companions, or all of the people of Mecca rather, in front of the Kaaba. And they were awaiting the judgment of the Prophet. And these are, of course, people who know the truth and didn't embrace the faith, but at a second level, opposed the Prophet, created problems for the Prophet, did everything in their power to try to get rid of the Prophet. So here they are. And of course, the Prophet turned to them. Many of them, of course, his relatives. Because if you're from Mecca, many of the other people who are in that city technically are your blood relatives. They might be a little bit more distant, but technically most of the people there are from Quraysh. And of course, the Prophet is from Quraysh. He is, of course, from a sub-tribe of Quraysh known as Bani Hashim, But nonetheless, he is part of the 20 plus tribes within the tribe of Quraysh. So he had all of them gathered, many of them his relatives, and he said, today I will forgive you, and I will do exactly as my brother Yusuf did to his brothers, and the way he forgave them. This was the forgiveness of the Prophet. So he forgave them, and now Mecca was available to the Prophet. Now many of us would assume that now the Prophet, maybe, if he was like you and I, would forget about his companions and his friends and all of those who supported him when he had nobody and he had nothing. Because before the Prophet came to Medina, there was no one to support him. Medina became that safe haven for the Prophet. And in fact, it came out of nowhere. No one was expecting Medina to become that safe haven. So what did the Prophet do? Now Mecca is open to him. Technically, this is his home. Technically, most of his life he has lived here. If it's you and I, we forget about those who have worked hard for us. We forget about those who have supported us in difficult times. We sit there and say, listen, alhamdulillah, Mecca is now available. I'm going to move to Mecca. I'm going to reestablish myself here and we'll move forward. But what do you find? The Prophet, immediately he saw his companions started to get worried. Is the Prophet thinking about leaving us? Is he thinking about going back to Mecca? And we want him to be in Medina. And the Prophet said what? The Prophet said, no, I will go back with all of you to Medina. And he said, my blood is your blood. Meaning we are tied to one another. Because of all the sacrifices that the people of Medina had made for me. All the battles that they had gone through. Because of defending Islam and defending me, I will never forget the work that the people of Medina did for me. And though the city of Mecca was now liberated and the Prophet could have lived there if he wanted to, you find that Medina came to be known as the city of the Prophet. Forgiveness when it comes to relatives, never forgetting the sacrifices of your friends and those whom you might come across in life. Two of the important lessons that we learn from highlighting the conquest of Mecca.